What's up, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Q&A session. This is a doctor-led Q&A session for everything survival, medicine, life, everything in between. So this is coming from questions from our own students in our private community and also our dedicated followers and supporters. So welcome. Let me know where you guys are coming from in the comments. If you haven't had a chance to ask your specific question to a doctor and get it answered right now, ask it in the comments. And even if you're watching the replay, ask it in the comments because we will use those questions in our next month's Q&A. So we had a few really good questions coming up, and one of them comes from our bushcraft enthusiast student who has the big question of the month is, what are your cold weather tips? And how do I control moisture control? So there was two people that asked, one from our student and one from our follower. And what the second part two of the question is, hey, I am a woman of an elder age. I do have some hot flashes. I get a little sweaty at night. How do I control moisture in a long-term survival situation, or even in like a overnight weekend camping situation? So those are kind of the two questions to start off with. Let me know if you guys can hear me okay, and we can get going. We got some people coming from Alabama, all over the place. Welcome. So what do you guys know about cold weather materials or shelters, clothing that you would wear? Because the very basis of what keeps you warm on your body, you can use the same concepts when thinking about building your emergency shelters and really thinking about the best location for surviving the night. So in this situation, hey Ryan, what's up? So Ryan is one of our students. Welcome, Ryan. Thank you for the engagement. Thank you for the great questions. This one's for you, brother. We are talking about cold weather survival. So number one, know what your layers should be. So if I'm going on an adventure, I was just hunting last weekend and it was raining, it was cold, it was just above freezing level. So some of the things that I would want to pack and to make sure that you always have on you, especially in a cold environment, is do you have wool or fleece? And do you have base layers? Do you have mid layers? Do you have puffer jackets? Do you have a shell? Do you have something reflective? So those are kind of a few different materials that are really helpful. And one of the things that I would say is that when we're thinking about not only the things that we can layer on, but the ventilation and breathability of each component. So the whole process of what layers go where and how do you kind of upgrade your insulation and downgrade insulation, it's very much so a stage where you kind of go in between. So typically at the very beginning, when you're starting your hike, you want to go as cold as you can physically bear, because just your movement creates energy, creates heat. So at that stage, even in minus, let's say 30 degrees Celsius or minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which is even colder, I have been using base layers and just covering any exposed skin. So that's with a rucksack, maybe 30 to 40 pounds, base layer, and then gloves, face covering, goggles, and a beanie, and snow pants, basically. And you're wanting to start off cold. And then as you rest or take a break, just noticing what the moisture level is. One of the things that I recently incorporated in my base layers this year was thanks to Bear Essentials, my buddy DJ. He made a video out there. If you haven't checked it out, check it out, because he does a review on netting. So it's kind of like a fish net looking thing that you would think that someone would wear at an EDM concert, but traditionally back in the day with explorers and fishermen and that type of thing, there was a reason why they carried that material for their base layer. Number one, it dries really quickly. And number two, if you buy a netted kind of base layer, whether it's a long sleeve or a short sleeve, the the thickness of it also increases the airspace. So let's say you have that knitted shirt, which if the wind blows on you, it is cold. But if you have a layer on top of that, like your mid layer or something that's loose, like a windbreaker, that netted material, which can either be wool or a synthetic like nylon, that actually creates an extra waffle, like an air gap, and that increases the insulation of that shirt, even though it has a bunch of holes in it, which is mind blowing. Because when I went to Alaska and I used this, Not only did it feel warmer if I had a layer on top of it compared to, let's say, just a regular synthetic layer, it was also incredibly fast to dry off. So I would stop maybe 15, 20 minutes, waft it in the air, and it would be relatively dry enough to completely dry with just my body heat once everything was wiped down. So that's super, super impressive for a base layer and something that I highly, highly recommend. Now, there's a spectrum of clothing that you can buy that's really high scale from like Finland or Norway that are really, really good products. But if you want to try it out for yourself, just go on Amazon. I'll put the link in the descriptions, and it's like a $20 for two shirts, and I use it for jujitsu as well, so you can use it for multiple different situations. Now, moving on to like a mid layer, two materials that I highly, highly recommend, especially if you are thrifting and love thrifting. I know I do, is to look for wool, look for fleece. And how I typically like layering is I have my fleece on the inside because it's number one, lighter. So if you're thinking about reducing the weight of your pack or the weight of your go bag, fleece is lighter than wool. And it still retains our value, warmth value, if damp. So to give you an example, I was camping with one of my buddies, Reno, and we were out by a river, and this was like borderline freezing time, and I actually fell into the river, and it was a very scary situation because I got pinned almost in a filter type of situation, the worst situation that you can think of, where you're being sucked underneath a log, and I was able to get out on top of that. But I wanted to pack light. I packed just one set of clothing, and I had a fleece layer and a wool layer. They both got wet, and just by wringing them dry, putting them on, you still feel that warmth, which is essential in these situations. So I wouldn't mess around with other materials like cotton for that specific situation, fleece, wool, because it can be warm when wrung out, even when damp. Now, the reason why I like wool on the outside is not only are you adding insulation layer and it's warm, but you're also adding that fireproofness. So if you've ever been around a fire and was using either your Lululemons or whatever you guys wear that's synthetic, you'll notice that just a tiny little spark burns a hole in it. And sometimes if it catches on fire, because it is, some of them are petroleum based or plastic based, that can melt really, really quickly and burn you. So that's why I like doing wool on top, because it doesn't have that same effect. So base layer, mid layer, and then wool outer shell, and then on top of that I have like a windbreaker type of shell. If you want to go full, like this is what I would bring to the Arctic -40. Two other things that I really like bringing with me is just a simple windbreaker. Like think about your 80s, 70s style windbreaker that's not necessarily waterproof, but has a barrier where it creates an air gap. And just having that on top of your body creates that air gap, especially in cold, dry environments, that makes it pretty darn warm. So we see that in military operations where all they're putting above their parka or above their sweaters is just this thin kind of cotton poly blend hoodie, which is just a thin layer. It almost feels like a sheet. And that is enough to give you enough warmth, especially when you're moving around. And that's why a lot of the old anoraks are kind of cotton based on the outside in warm and dry environments. And the logic behind that is in those environments, you're not necessarily getting super wet. So cotton can be an acceptable material. And one trick that I have for you guys, for those of you who want to try cold weather stuff, let's say -20, -30 degrees Celsius, and you're getting a little damp, your outerwear, so your jackets, your parka, should be outside. So that's one big tip, because if you're in and out, especially if you have heat inside your tent, like a stove, whether it's a Coleman stove or a wood stove, that moisture from the inside will kind of seep into that material. And over time, let's say if you're out there for a week, or if you're trying to do alone for multiple different days, that will have some moisture locked into it, and the R value suffers. Instead, if you are truly in that Arctic type of environment, if you have your parka on the outside, all you need to do in the morning, even if it has some moisture from your sweat, is to shake it. So you shake it and all the little ice particles kind of fall off. And since you have your outer layers, like your sweaters and your mid layers on, you're not going to feel that cold chill when you put on your jacket. So that's a really, really good tip for that. Now, I just want to get some questions and comments over here. Wool can absorb up to 62% of its weight in water and still maintain its ability to warm you. Absolutely. It's such an incredible material. Be sure to wring it out if you can, especially if you're fully submerged, because, yes, even though it can absorb 62% of its weight in water, you want to reduce that amount of water in the material itself and increase the amount of air pockets they have in the wool itself. So that's a little bit about layers. And when we think about those different types of layers, we talked about our base layers, our mid layers, the type of material, other type of vapor barriers like your rain jackets or your windbreakers. Another thing in environments that require you to stay still a lot, whether it's fishing or hunting and waiting on a trap line, a reflective layer or an ability to integrate in and out a reflective layer is also really useful because you can reflect your own body heat back to you. Now, one thing that is a little bit iffy is if you are using that material in an active type of activity. So if you are a mountaineer or you're hiking or you're doing something that's a very high intensity activity, what's probably going to happen is you're going to generate so much heat that it will reflect back to you and you'll start sweating. And you want to reduce the amount of sweat as much as possible. So as you're looking for materials, the one modification that I would recommend that everyone do to their winter or cold weather gear is to make sure that they have really good ventilation. So you'll notice on Alone, you'll notice on all the stuff that I carry, whether it's mid layers, over layers, or jackets, or even rain pants, snow pants, bibs, they all have zippers almost the whole length of above your elbow all the way down to the mid chest, both sides, and then from your hips all the way down to your ankles for your pants for ventilations in these cold environments. That way, the moment you feel like you're just about to break a sweat, you layer down and then you ventilate so that your equipment is always as dry as possible. And that's kind of the biggest mistake that I see with a lot of people new to cold weather activities is they're cold and they wear as much as possible. Then they do the activities, get super sweaty, and they don't necessarily have a change of clothes and get really, really cold really fast. And that kind of exactly, Gemini, you sweat, you die. And that's especially the case if it's a prolonged experience, which we're going to jump into kind of prolonged experience in cold weather tips. So, number one, have good gear. One thing that I would emphasize is the type of boot you have is also super important. So, just looking at the available mucklucks out there, there's not, to be honest, there's not a whole lot of impressive footwear for extreme cold weather out there, but there are some. And I think it's worthwhile noting because if you either are the type of person who gets cold toes, which is really, really common, and have a history of frostbite, and every little frost nip that you get is extremely painful, this is the time to pay attention because these types of boots are like absolute lifesavers. And it's one of the reasons why I was barefoot most of Alone season night well into the winter because my boots were so darn warm and they were just like slippers for me. So number one on my list, so this is something that I personally own, is the Baffin Eigers. That's Eigger, I believe. And it's on my website at survivaldoctors.com/store. I have all the recommendations on the gear that I personally use. That's one of them. The one tip for that specific brand is try to go 2 sizes up and make sure whoever you buy it from, you can return it because they tend to come in a little tight. So make sure they're not too super tight. But that is super well insulated, and it also has a reflective layer on not only on the sole but in the actual insulation in the boot itself, and you can remove the inner layer and dry it. So I was drying it every single night when I came home, so every morning it was bone dry and ready for adventure. Number two are the old American, not Canadian, American winter boots. They're the Arctic, quote unquote, Mickey Mouse boots. And they look like Mickey Mouse boots. You can get them in black, you can get them in white. But the cool, interesting type of design is that the insulation is actually enclosed in rubber and you can inflate it. So, air is a great insulator. And in these boots, you can actually pump air into this boot and increase your insulation. The caveat to it is rubber through and through. So one thing that I would recommend is if you can find a good wool insert that fits you well, go up a few sizes on the Mickey Mouse boot, see if the wool insert fits. And that'd be a good combination, because the one thing that happens when your boot is completely waterproof in an Arctic situation is you tend to get wet just from your foot sweat. That's why you'll notice on a lot of the mucklucks and a lot of the old school mucklucks, including the Canadian military mucklucks, is that the waterproof part is just near the foot of it. And the rest of it is a somewhat breathable material that can dry as well. Now, those are the two ones that I personally like. And the traditional ones, the ones where it's made out of leather and wool and tar on the bottom, those are really nice for cold and dry situations. But the moment they get wet, it can be pretty difficult and set you up for some frostbite on your toes. One cool tip that I learned from Lure of the North with Kai from Alone season 7 is I was out doing medical checks for their group on an Arctic expedition, and they were, I don't know how many miles they did, but it must have been over 50. And one of the things that they had to do is traverse for a very long time through river systems. And they sometimes, when it's too warm, they punch through the ice and hit water, not all the way to where the water flows, but like a ice layer where the ice is melting on the inside and the top layer is kind of crusty, and they just punch through, and your foot gets wet. One thing that they've been doing that I thought was really, really interesting and such a great tip is that at the moment that happens, if it's a dry, snowy environment, immediately put your foot out, cover it in snow, and kind of rub it off. The dry snow almost acts like as a sponge, and you're able to absorb a lot of that water if you get to it fast enough, so it's not absorbing into your boot itself. So that, I thought that was such a cool tip. And one of the things that was really reminiscent of being in the military, especially in cold weather operations, is your canteen. So water is important. We often don't think about water when we think about heat, but your blood is the fluid that keeps everything warm. So if you're dehydrated, which is common in cold environments, you are going to be cold. Especially you'll feel it on your tips of your nose, your ears, your lips, your fingers, your toes, and your genital areas, because those are the areas that are most exposed to the cold. So hydrate, hydrate, hydrate more than you think you need to, and use your pee as a kind of barometer of how hydrated you are. If it's kind of clear yellow, great. The scary part is when, before I knew anything about medicine and was in the military at the peak of my physique and ruck marching with 60 pounds on my back, pulling a 200-pound sled with 2 other people, the pee was red. And I had no idea what that was from. I thought it was because we were drinking so many like Gatorades and electrolytes that had all sorts of different dyes. But that's your body telling you you are very, very dehydrated. That's your body telling you that you're actually breaking down muscle tissue and protein, and it's coming down into your urinary system, and it's painting everything red. So that's the muscle breakdown tissue that almost makes you think that you're bleeding, but it turns out that it's red as well. And if it gets really dark and muddy, just know that you're causing a lot of damage to your kidneys because you're not drinking. So hydrate to make sure that you're getting good blood flow everywhere so they can keep warm. Another thing is for hydration. How many of you have been in a very cold environment? And let me know how cold of environment you've been and what is your record coldness, and I'll let you know mine. My record kind of cold environment was minus 60 Celsius. So that's really darn cold. That's the type of cold where you throw up some boiling water and it just showers down as snow. And I remember at nights where it was just so bone chilling. And especially even in the day when you're marching with all your equipment and you're getting thirsty and you reach into your canteen, and you see this a lot with privates or people first being introduced in that type of cold weather. They go in for a drink and it's completely solid, especially at the cap, because most bottles at the cap of it is thinner. So that freezes, especially if the bottle is upright. So the one big tip that I have from you so you don't suffer from dehydration when you're going on your hikes in these cold environments is to have a bottle carrier. And that's just kind of like a little satchel for your bottle. And all you need to do, turn it upside down, put it inside your coat so it's warm. And if it does freeze, it freezes on the bottom of the bottle instead of the top, so that when you flip it up to drink it, the cap is not frozen, the access to the water isn't broken or frozen, and you're able to drink. The two types of bottles that I typically bring, even though it's a little heavier, is one, I have a single walled metal, wide brimmed bottle that I always carry. So you can boil water in it, you can purify water in it. And the second one is an insulated bottle. Every time I go on Arctic expeditions, I was with Benji from Alone season 9 in Idaho, and we were on snowmobiles looking for predators, wolves, and mountain lions. And I definitely had a 2-liter insulated canteen. And even though it was like one of those Stanleys that weighed a brick, it was worth it because I was able to drink water very easily, very quickly, with no concerns about it freezing or me needing to boil water, whether that's from a jet boil or having to make a fire to get some simple water. So those two are super, super vital to bring with you. -14, -30. We got some people coming from cold environments. Winnie, where are you coming? That's -30. I know in Montreal we get some -30s, but that's still pretty darn cold. Susie's coming from Florida. Huge fan of wool, hats, socks, and gloves. Definitely love that combination. Um, and we have people from Oregon. Welcome, welcome. Awesome, Cheryl. I'm glad we're getting to your question. So Cheryl's the one who asked about I have hot flashes. I get a little sweaty at night, which is completely normal. That happens to everyone, and even people who don't have hot flashes, they get sweaty at night. And this brings a controversial topic, I think, of should you sleep with your clothes on, as much clothes as possible in your sleeping bag, or should you be completely naked? There's definitely two bodies of thought, but what I want to give to you tonight is context, because you will see good kind of recommendations for both of them, but they're very different situations. So the people advocating for put as much clothes as you want to stay warm, know what kind of sleeping setup they have, because often the case, their sleeping bag is not rated for the comfort in that environment. So we see that a lot with like mountaineers who are super ultralight. Everything's on their back, so they want to go as light as possible. So if you look at their sleeping bag, it is pretty darn thin. You know, it's almost like a survival blanket at that moment where your sleep is very, very uncomfortable. And in that case, sure, your shelter, your sleeping cocoon is not rated for that environment. So that might be a good idea to wear your clothes on the inside if it's dry. Number two, the other situation is if you have a great sleeping bag, if you have a Juan Pablo sleeping bag, which is like a -40 down on the inside, synthetic on the outside, and you would sweat if you wore anything more than a t-shirt, then don't bring extra clothes inside, especially if you're going to be warm. One tip that I do have for you is if you want to dry off some of your clothes, and you have the ability to buy a bivy bag, whether it's a Gore-Tex bivy bag or some other new material that's probably on market. It's a bag that's water resistant, somewhat breathable, but really not that breathable, but that goes over your sleeping bag. And you can put your clothing in that in between on top of your sleeping bag, but inside that bivy bag to keep your clothing warm and to dry it out if it's slightly damp. Because in those environments, there's kind of two options or three options. You dry it outside, let it freeze, and flick off the ice kind of flakes. Two, you try to dry it off with your own body heat. And three, you try to heat it with inside your tent, which even if you're heating it initially inside the tent and it's somewhat dry, I would bet money by the time you wake up, because it's hung on the inside of your tent and there's not the best ventilation, just the moisture from your breath will make it pretty darn damp, unfortunately. So when we're thinking about moisture control in those situations, instead of bringing all your clothing in for a sleeping bag that's rated for that environment, what I would do was either put it in between the layers between your sleeping bag and bivy bag, or if you want to bring it in, make sure it's warm so that when you get up in the morning and you're putting things on, it's not super freezing. You can layer it on the bottom, and this is what I did on Alone Season 9, is I just made an extra platform for myself, nicely folded, and it was like a 1 centimeter, 2 centimeter layer of wool where I just slept on the back, and if needed, I could use it as a blanket and put it over myself, which is much better than if you are wrapped in a big cocoon of your own clothing, get really sweaty and start ripping things off in the middle of the night because you're sweating. It's much better to kind of slowly put things on. And the one thing that I do love, love, love is a wool shamog. So shamogs, if you think about people in the Middle East that wear kind of shawls over their heads and kind of protects their face against the sun and the sand, there are other shamogs that are not made out of cotton, that are made out of wool, that I love for cold weather environments, because we know wool is really good for those types of environments, but also as something as a light blanket on the inside. And for any instance of just the minute amount of sweat, you're immediately wiping that down. So that is super, super essential and something that always comes with me when I'm doing cold weather sleeping. Another thing, when we're talking about moisture control, is based on shelters. As we're moving into like talking about like shelters, moisture becomes a real issue if you are in an environment where you plan on being there for more than a day. A lot of people, your body is capable of surviving incredible extremes. People who have that reflective emergency blanket bivy where they just cocoon in there and sleep in there for one night will likely survive for sure. But you'll notice, if you've ever done it yourself, that you shiver through the night if that's the only thing that you're using. And the second thing that you might notice is a lot of moisture inside that bag. And because it doesn't breathe well, especially if you are putting your mouth inside the bag, you are breathing a lot of moisture out. And to give you an example of how much moisture you can breathe out from just breathing at high altitudes, think of your Kilimanjaro, thinking of your Everest, over 4,000 meters of height. You're breathing so quickly that the amount of water that you produce overnight can be as much as 2 liters. So imagine dumping a Nalgene bottle all over your clothes, all over your sleeping bag every single night if you're sleeping inside your sleeping bag. And that will definitely feel a difference within a few nights out there. So instead of pulling everything over your face because you're so cold, I would much rather you have a sleeping bag that's almost like a mummy design, where this is the only thing that's showing. So look for that when you're selecting your sleeping bags. And if you don't have that, modify your sleeping bag so you're making almost like a wrap around your head and face and neck, so that your neck is a cork to your sleeping bag, and your face is covered, your eyes are mostly covered, and all that's really showing is a little bit of your nostrils and all that gunky stuff when you're breathing. One neck warmer that I absolutely love and still have from the Canadian Army, that I got at a military surplus, was a neck warmer that has a little bit of a mesh in the front. So you can breathe through it, but the cold, brisk feeling doesn't touch your lips necessarily. So cover everything as much as possible, but don't put it in your sleeping bag because it will ruin things for the long term. When we think about that emergency blanket, how can we use it as something to modify our shelter or improvised shelter, and not get super sweaty? Is all you have to do, just like a lot of these survival shelters, is about a foot and a half off your body. So you allow space for that vapor not to touch your clothes. Because if it's really close, you can feel a lot of that wetness. It's almost like someone just sprayed it with water and it's just wet to the touch. One thing that we do for 10-man tents, and one of the reasons why there's so many layers in a 10-man military tent, and oftentimes it's like a cotton blend, is when we're inside the tent, we're cooking. We have Coleman stoves in there. We have lanterns in there, and there's a lot of moisture and vapor there. The cotton in that first layer is to absorb a lot of that moisture. so that it doesn't kind of drop down on us like rain on the inside of our tent. So if you have any material that you can spare on a long-term shelter that's on the inside, you can do that as your first layer to absorb some of that moisture that's really close to your body. So again, a foot, foot and a half, and then your reflective layer, then your insulation layer, and then kind of like a waterproof barrier. It's kind of almost exactly like how you would layer on clothing. So you got your base layer, which is something that can absorb or transfer the sweat. So in this case, in a shelter, it would be maybe like a cotton piece of cloth or something like that that's out there, or like a shredded up t-shirt that's cotton that you really don't want to use as a base layer anyways. So you can open it up and just put it on the top of your tarp setup. Then you have a reflective layer that's close to your body because it's reflecting your own heat rays back to you. Then you have your insulation layers. So in a survival situation, whether you're using a structure and then snow on top of it, or if it's more like the environment right now in the fall, using a lot of leaves. And when I say a lot of leaves, a lot of leaves. So we're thinking about 2 to 3 feet. And if you're using, let's say, spruce boughs or pine tree boughs, it is a lot. It is a lot. So you're doing at least 2 to 3 feet of kind of insulation, because when you're doing that, especially with spruce boughs, it's not 100% sealed. So even though if it slows down the heat transfer, it's still slowly dissipating. So you do need a very big layer. And one of the things that I would emphasize is that if you've never tried to build a debris shelter, we're going to do a challenge this month. Our students are going to do this. So Ryan, this one's for you. We're going to do some videos on debris shelters, and I want you to live in that at least for an overnight, to see what it feels like, to see how fast you can build a debris shelter that's at least 2 to 3 inches or feet of insulation, and to see how warm that is just with the clothing that you have on. Maybe just take a nap in it overnight and then get out of there, or go into your tent. But try that, because it takes more time than you would think and more insulation than you would think, especially when you're insulating the inside and the outside, and making that nice plug for your entrance too. A quick tip for you, for those of you who have backpacks that are going out, rain flies are something that's super, super useful, because a typical rain fly, like I have like maybe like a 35-liter day pack, and the rain fly on it is basically from the top of my shoulder all the way down to my hip for the rain fly that goes over the bag. So what I do is I put as much debris as possible in it. So packed leaves, pine tree duff, which is like the brown pine needles that kind of litter the floor. You pack that nicely, and you actually have like a 4 to 6 inch sleeping pad. And if you do that on your back and your torso, and just use your backpack as your feet, you have an instant sleeping pad. So if you have like an improvised shelter, or you're doing like an emergency shelter with just like a tarp, you can get that padding to sleep on it for a few hours of sleep very, very quickly without having to build anything up. So it's a very fast way to do that. Yeah, some people have some really good mummy bags. Awesome. So one of the things that I do want to announce, that if you aren't a student right now, check out our private community, our program. We go in depth and give you a framework on how to approach a lot of these survival situations, and also the medical repercussions of these survival situations at www.survivenow.online/lifeline. So one thing that's open to our students, and Ryan, this is for you as well, and Donna, we do have swag that we give for our challenges. So every month we have a challenge. This month we're going to have an outdoor challenge. We also have medical challenge, where you can win things like tourniquets that are directly from North American Rescue or Sam Medical, and full on $180 plus medical packs from North American Rescue. So if you're interested in getting kitted out and actually learning and practicing these skills, check out our private community. Your first 30 days is free, so you can learn a bunch of different stuff. You can enter into a challenge, win some more stuff, and be just so much better and more capable of responding to emergencies and protecting your family. So that's survivenow.online/lifeline, and 4 is our newest one. So check that out. We do have some other questions that's outside of cold weather. And this is from one of our students, Donna, who wanted to know, and this is a very kind of a little bit of a downer, but very important. When do you stop your resuscitation? When do you stop your efforts to keep someone alive? And that comes into question, I think, most often in cardiac arrests. So cardiac arrest is when your heart stops, and we just did a chapter on this last month, and we just uploaded our 2024 American Heart Association updates for our field guide. So if you're interested in that, let me know in the comments. But it is tough. We had 2 big resuscitations the other week, and I just got a phone call from the dad of one of the kids we saw, and he was just in tears because I didn't know at the moment what happened, because we got his heart back. We did a full resuscitation. We got him to a bigger hospital, but he was just bawling and wanted to talk. And I wasn't sure if it was a good talk or a bad talk, but I was open to hear what he wanted to talk about. And he was just so grateful because that day his son woke up from a coma, which he had been medically induced, but he was so unstable that he needed to be in that medically induced coma for over a week. And this was like a young person. So it is super, super important to not only know the skills, know like how to give great CPR, because anyone can do chest compressions. It's fairly simple. You can watch a YouTube video and literally do it right now, but it takes a little bit of knowledge and practice on making sure that it's so effective, and you're kind of adjusting your posture, your hand position, you're noticing subtle things, that your chances of getting someone back is just that much higher. And that's what I want for all of you out there. And that's one of the reasons why we went over that material in our private community last month. And the flip side of that is everyone wants to have that moment where they can bring someone back. There are situations where even if we brought someone back, it would be not fair for that person because of the limitations on what type of quality of life that they can live. And it wouldn't necessarily be the best thing for them because of maybe their age and the amount of damage that we potentially could be doing or worsening by going through that resuscitation. So to give you an example, when you're doing chest compressions, good quality chest compressions, the likelihood is we do break some ribs. We're pushing down 1/3 of your height of your chest. So oftentimes, especially in elder patients, we break ribs. Very, very painful, can puncture things as well. Number 2 is we don't know. It's never a guarantee that we bring someone back. It's actually the rates of bringing people back is quite low on the scale of, sometimes it's like 50-50, sometimes it's like 60-40. It's not the best outcomes. The best outcomes is if someone sees that person collapse and is able to intervene almost immediately. People who are found down for only minutes have a vastly different recovery rates and chances of coming back. So rule of thumb in the emergency setting is, if you see someone who's found down, definitely do your chest compressions, get an AED, try to figure out what else can be going on. That's why we teach our emergency interventions, our emergency diagnostics in our private community. But there are telltale signs that this may likely go in a very bad direction. And the one key thing that I almost always look for very early on in the resuscitation is their pupils. So unfortunately, in this day and age, we have a lot of people overdosing from fentanyl. And the scary thing is a lot of these are accidental overdoses. People who are buying something and having it laced with fentanyl and then passing away from that. And one of the things that we commonly see in these situations when people just find these people in their apartments or on the streets is they've been without oxygen so long that their brain kind of swells. And when it swells, it starts to push itself out of the one tiny hole at the base of the skull, foramen magnum. And when that does that, it pushes on the brainstem, which controls your breathing. And what we typically see when the brain swells like that is the pupils change. So when you're on an opiate, they're very pinpoint. But as things start to swell, one of the pupils might get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then as wide as possible. And then the other one starts to get bigger, bigger, bigger. And then it doesn't change. You can poke them in the eye, touch their eyes. It's not reactive. You shine lights in there, it's not reactive. That's when I have a pretty good idea that there is limited brain activity and there's so much swelling from not having enough oxygen that the likelihood of them coming back with an intact brain function is very, very low. So in those situations, we'll do our due diligence with the resuscitation, but I would not go more than like 30, 40 minutes trying to bring this person back because they'll likely come back brain dead. So sombering topic, but a very good question for everyone, Donna. So I appreciate you asking that one. All right. What other things are people curious about? Because this is all for you. And we have about 5 minutes left. We have some other topics like skin closure, boating injuries, car crashes. One interesting one, I thought this was really interesting from one of our followers on YouTube. They were mentioning, can caffeine help your asthma? Which I was like, I didn't really learn that in medical school, but I was so curious that I did some research, looked at some meta-analyses from a good research paper that was actually a controlled study. So that means they do a blinding where they have a control and then caffeine, and people might not know which one they're getting. And I think that study also did a low dose caffeine. So even though they were getting caffeine, it was such a low dose that it acted as a control because it wouldn't really do anything because of the low dose. And the interesting thing is that caffeine can help as a mild, very mild asterisk bronchodilator, which helps you breathe when you have asthma attacks. But the kind of downside is, does it work better than an asthma inhaler? And likely the case, and I can almost definitively say, no, it probably doesn't. So caffeine for treatment of asthma, not the best. Will caffeine help you if you so happen to have an asthma exacerbation and you're getting your inhaler? Sure, it might help a bit, because the researchers mentioned that caffeine can affect how your asthma improves, so much so that it may alter your studies for testings of asthma. So let's say if you've never got tested for asthma and you're going to do that test, having caffeine in your system, a good dose of caffeine, is enough to alter those tests in a good way. So there's some evidence for it. But personally, I don't drink coffee. It gives me palpitations and everything in moderation. But I wouldn't necessarily say that that's an asthma treatment. Definitely would avoid your allergens. Definitely would practice safe hygiene and protections against common colds, because that's what we're seeing right now. A lot of colds leading to asthma exacerbations and me needing to give you steroids and new inhalers. And then also, if you can, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to stop smoking, stop vaping. And Winnie, coming here a little bit late, what fabric do you recommend for a base layer? So if you can't afford it, or if you can find it, even in Costco, I think Costco has this right now, merino wool. It's the non-itchy wool, really high quality stuff, and a really good layer. I would prefer merino wool over a synthetic, but there is a price difference. So if you can either get it from somewhere like Costco, which is a reasonable price because there's such a huge markup for kind of brand name stuff, I would do merino wool. And I would also think about merino wool or synthetic netted base layers, because that's kind of like something that I've really loved using. All right, so we have a really nice question over here. I'm 52, borderline high blood pressure. Any ideas to bring it down without meds? So one question that I do have for you, for anyone who's kind of over 40, I'm getting close to there, believe it or not, But check your blood pressure, go to Walmart, go to the pharmacy, check your blood pressure. If it's above 140, over 90, this is kind of your wake up call to see your family doctor, evaluate a few things, because to diagnose high blood pressure, it's a reading of 140 over 90, so slash 90 or above in two different situations at two different times. So if you kind of do it twice in two different locations when you're relaxed and not super stressed or angry, and it's still above that, then you likely have high blood pressure. The first thing that I look at when I see someone with borderline high blood pressure, let's say you're like in the 135s over 85s, how much do you weigh and what is your ideal body weight? So there are BMI calculators, which isn't the most accurate measure of health, but it's a measure. If there's a more accurate measure that comes out, a more logical measure that comes out, we will use it, but we need to measure and have a point of measure for these things. So one of the things is how much do you weigh? Are you overweight based on the BMI scale? Are you obese based on the BMI scale? And this is for someone who isn't like a bodybuilder or an extreme athlete that has a bunch of muscles making that scale off. This is just a regular person living a 9 to 5 and maybe having a little more heft on the center area. So that's one thing that I would look at. Number two is your diet. Are you having a lot of fried food, junk food, snacks, that type of thing? Are you drinking sodas? So there is kind of like a trio of things that happen, like a metabolic syndrome that happens with high blood pressure, cholesterol issues, diabetes. They all kind of come in at similar times and they work off of each other. Just like smoking, I'm pretty sure everyone knows that smoking and high cholesterol can cause blockages in your arteries. But just like that, high blood pressures can make your arteries change. They get a little more stiff and blood flow becomes a little less great. So your chances of getting a heart attack increases. Same thing for diabetes. It affects your blood vessels. So it is your time to really dig deep and say, am I a little too hefty for my height? Am I eating things that aren't the best for me? Am I smoking or vaping? And am I drinking soda? Sodas for diabetes is kind of like the worst thing. It's just a liquid calories and it's so easy to come down. Like I love Coke, but I try to limit just like this much from a glass just to get the flavor, the taste, the accompaniment with the meal. But that's it, because it really, really adds a lot of badness to your life on the long term. So for those borderline people, lifestyle modifications, if it's not borderline and you're actually hypertensive, know that that 140 over 90 isn't a random number. We don't, it is a number that starts to change your organs, starts to change your risk factors for getting heart attacks and strokes. It is the number that says you either need to work on things really quickly, or the other option is, let's say, hey, you've been living this way for such a long amount of time. It's going to take some time to kind of cut back on what we're smoking, cut back on what we're drinking, cut back on what we're eating. I would highly recommend you take the blood pressure medicine as you ramp up some of those lifestyle changes. That way, you're not continuing damage while you're making those changes, because we see this a lot in diabetes and pre-diabetes, where people say like, oh, I'm just going to lose some weight, change my diet a little bit, but they're very, very diabetic and their A1C, which is the average of their blood sugars, are in the double digits. So in that amount, you are, every day that you are living at that level, you're damaging every single organ in your body, from your eyes to your hearts to your skin to your everything, your kidneys. And the more time you wait to make those changes while you're still very diabetic or hypertensive or high blood pressure, that doesn't decrease your chance of dying from those events. So I hope that gives you some insight, and I hope that helps you make an appointment with your family doctor, because that would be a good thing for everyone. Now, so for those of you who ask questions, thank you, thank you, thank you. We're wrapping up right now. Again, if you want to be the type of person who wins awesome things, whether it's swag, survival equipment like knives, saws, tourniquets, first aid kits. We have a huge first aid kit. Where is it? We have things like Duration Health, these huge adventure series first aid kits up for grabs for our students. So if you are interested in winning some of that, all you need to do is learn, enter one of our challenges, and show us what skills you got. So without further ado, the link is in the bio. Thank you guys for hanging out. Thank you so much for your questions. This would be available for replay over the next few days, but then it's going to be private for our students only. So if you are thinking about learning more about survival medicine, or just learning how to save a life or maintain your life in a survival situation, check out our private community. It is free for the first 30 days. That's our promotion going on right now, and hope to see you guys there. Take care, guys. Thank you. And I'll see you next time.